Welcome to Constitutional Soundbites, brought to you by Sat Media. I'm Matt, the Parable, and with the author of the book, Dave Shestokas.
Hello, Matt. It's great to be back.
It is great.
It's nice to be here for, the third edition. Of Constitutional Soundbites brought to me by Sat Media.
Sat Media, yep.
Brought to me, brought to you, brought to everybody.
Brought to you.
Brought to you by Sat Media, yes, which is just a growing platform. I'm so happy to be associated with it and do this project to bring this information to the American people, John.
Which it belongs.
Yeah.
The Constitution belongs with them. So let's jump in.
Absolutely.
And, first one, constitutional considerations. We got our first question that you can fill us in about. And
why don't you give us a little introduction on that? This is Constitutional Considerations section of Volume 1 of Constitutional Soundbites.
Yes. By now you should have bought the book, so you can read right along. What events during the Christmas of 1776 saved United States independence and set the stage for the Constitution? So we're talking about a holiday. There had to have something that happened during that.
Something had to happen during that course of time. And of course, there was the winter of 1776, which was just a horrendous winter. And Washington's army was, they actually signed contracts, the guys to be in the Continental Army in those days. There was contracts that were between them and the Continental Congress. And most of the army, their contracts were up on New Year's Day, 1777. And the army was not doing well. It had been chased into primarily Bucks County, Pennsylvania, they'd been chased out of New York largely. And Washington did a lot of strategic withdrawals. He did a lot of strategic retreats in keeping his army alive from the major superpower of the time, the British Army. And so they gave up New York, but of course in those days in the late 18th century, it was traditional for armies to take a winter break.
Exactly.
Even if regardless of what was going on with the war and whatnot, because they didn't have any tanks or Humvees or other ways to get around or mostly keep warm. Most of the armies would have winter quarters.
Yeah. Well, take off and relax and assume again at a later time.
Yeah. So it was traditional, kind of in the European tradition and kind of the gallantry kind of thing that everybody would come to a conclusion that it's good. We're going to take the winter off, and in the spring we'll start fighting again.
Right.
But Washington's problem was that most of his troops, their enlistments were going to be up on the 1st of January in 1777, and so he needed to do something. He couldn't afford the luxury of taking the winter off, because he would have come out of the winter with essentially nobody.
Exactly, nothing left.
Yeah, and so that's when he came up with this incredibly bold and at that time unknown plan to launch a winter offensive.
Right.
A winter offensive, and there was something else that the Revolution needed at the time, because mostly there'd been losses. They'd not been very successful on the battlefield, and so there'd mostly been losses. So they needed a victory, and he needed to do something with the army before he lost it. And so on Christmas Eve, 1776, the country at this juncture is only 4 or 5 months old, and we don't even know that it's going to last.
Right.
We don't, they don't know that it's going to last at all. And he comes up with a bold plan to launch an attack on Trenton, New Jersey. And Trenton, New Jersey, at that particular point in time, was the winter quarters for the British Hessians, the Germans the
Yes.
Germans that the British had hired as mercenaries to augment the British troops, and the British troops themselves were wintering happily in New York. They were nice and warm in New York and Boston and places of that nature, and drinking wine and having a final winter. But they sent the Hessians down to take care of some places like Trenton,
Right.
New Jersey, and so Washington determined that he only had like 9 days left to before he had a significant army. While he still had a significant army,
An army. In
and
general.
an army. So what they wound up doing is, everybody's seen the famous picture of him standing in this longboat, and it's Washington crossing the Delaware.
Right.
Few people know what he's doing, why he's crossing the Delaware, and so they're in Pennsylvania in Bucks County, where their winter quarters are, and I think it's about 12 or 15 miles north to Trenton on the other side of the river, and he determines that on Christmas Eve night, going into Christmas Day, that they are actually going to launch an offensive against the Hessians that were occupying Trenton,
Right.
New Jersey, and they suffered greatly. And the night that they chose to do that turned out to be one of the most horrible winter storms there ever was. And there was a bunch of guys from Marlborough, Massachusetts, that were their boatmen that navigated these huge ice flows that were coming down the river, and they're trying to get across the river. Tanks, or not tanks, but cannon and horses, and 8,000 men from three different locations up and down the river, and the whole process of crossing the river in that horrible storm. They had, and I would actually earlier in the spring of 2021, I was there at the crossing, and you can look across it. It looks only, I don't know, maybe 300 yards, maybe 250.
It's not an easy crossing, anyways.
It's not an easy crossing, but it doesn't look hugely far. It doesn't. Maybe 2-3 football fields at tops. It doesn't look hugely far, but when it's frozen, and the ice is coming down, and these guys are going around scrounging boats up and down the coast from other people, it ultimately took about 12 hours for about 2,500 of the troops to get across. The rest of them didn't make it across. They got stopped, or the ice was too big, or whatever. So only about 2,500 made it across, and it took them on about 12 hours, and then it was about another 3 or 4 hours to get to Trenton. But as it turns out, that turned out to be a little lucky, because the Hessians had been celebrating on Christmas Eve.
Yes, they were stinking drunk.
That's exactly right. Including Colonel Rao. So they went in and they routed the Hessians quickly, and took somewhere in the neighborhood of 900 prisoners. And one of the casualties was, in fact, the colonel. The colonel did die. The interesting thing, though, the night before it was going to happen, there was a fellow by the name of Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a who was a member of Congress, that had come out to the camp and was talking with Washington the night before. And Washington told Rush of the plans and what they were going to do. And then Washington went out to talk to his officers to explain what he did. And Washington had been scribbling on a piece of paper while he was talking to Rush. And he crumpled up the piece of paper and dropped it in a wastebasket on his way out. And Rush went over and picked the piece of paper out of the basket. And he opened it up, and what Washington had written on the paper, was victory or death. And that's how close we came to not having a country. If without this evening, without that Christmas gift, if you will, to America, there is no United States.
Yeah.
There is no United States. It doesn't exist because that the army would not. There wouldn't be no more. There would not be an army, and but they had the victory in Princeton. One of the other interesting things was Thomas Paine was along with them, and before the troops embarked, he read from a new pamphlet that he had written, not Common Sense, but a new pamphlet, and that was the pamphlet that began. It's when these are difficult. These are the times that try men's soul,
right.
And it goes on. And Washington had Paine read that to the troops, and the troops went out and they conquered the Hessians that next morning after a long walk through the snow in a time when their feet were bleeding and and they were losing their shoes, and none of that was going on. And some of the founders, other founders, ultimately were with them. Alexander Hamilton was on that trip as a young lieutenant. Of course, Broadway fame now.
A little bit, yeah.
yeah, and a number of the other John Jay, who became the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court,
right.
And so there was some amazing other founders that were there. They weren't doing with pens and papers. They weren't writing declarations. They were out battling. They were actually fighting for the country, and for these ideals. And so I think that's important to know how close we came to losing it. It was really 10 days, because after that victory in Trenton on New Year's Day, or excuse me, on Christmas Day, over the next 10 days, they had a series of other victories on their way to taking Princeton too, and they had a series of other ultimate victories. And those 10 days are what revived and saved the war and saved the country. Without those 10 days, and that's the introduction to the first volume of the book, is to explain that without this,
we wouldn't have never proceeded to where we are even talking about the book.
Yeah, no, we wouldn't be here. We'd be doing something else. I don't know. We'd probably still be worrying about the British monarchy much more than we worry about it now.
Exactly. And sipping on tea, probably.
Sipping on tea and crumpets, and paying taxes. Paying taxes to the king.
Exactly.
And those kinds of things, and dealing with writs of assistance and some of the other things that we'll talk about. But that's what happened. And without that, there's no book, there's no country. And again, people, everybody's familiar with that painting, but they don't know
the story behind it.
They don't know the story behind it.
Right.
And the story behind it saved the country. And I think that's something that folks need to know.
It's a nice summer trip too. As a kid, I remember going, and my brother used to live in New Jersey, and we would go by the Delaware and into Philadelphia, and I remember going and spending a little time at Valley Forge, and which is it's a great park, and get to see history. Literally.
Yes, yeah, they've done a nice job of preserving that. Strangely enough, as I mentioned, I was there in the spring. There is, in fact, a statue, a life-size model, carved in stone, of the painting, right across from the crossing location. It's worth a trip.
Yeah.
It's worth a trip to know the story and to appreciate that location. That piece of, that's like a hallowed piece of ground, because while there was no American casualties actually in the Battle of Princeton, but there was casualties on the way getting there.
Right.
There were casualties on the way getting there. So important stuff.
Yes, so. Yeah. Please remember, America did not start in 1619.
No, it did not start in 1619. No. That's a fallacy that tries to rewrite history in a very unfortunate way, with a very unfortunate view, and it tries to achieve something different, and takes away the valor and the legend, or not the legend, but the importance of the sacrifice. how important freedom was to these folks.
Right.
And ultimately, I can't emphasize enough, it's set in motion. There's no other place that actually fought a war to abolish slavery.
Right.
It's set in motion that what would ultimately be, and we're still improving.
Yes.
We're still improving, but it's
Yes.
set in motion.
We step back a little bit, but I think we'll figure it out. If we beat tyranny once, I think we can beat tyranny again.
We've had to do it multiple times
Yes.
over the years. Some
Yes.
places sometimes around the world, and sometimes here.
Right.
But yeah, no, we can fight and win that battle again. And if we understand and take inspiration in some of the original battles that got us started.
Yep. So very good. So with that, we'll close out another episode of Constitutional Soundbites. Again, please buy the book, follow along, plop your kids in front of the TV or the phone or iPad and watch along. And Dave, thanks again.
Thank you, Matt. We look forward to getting together again soon.
Yes, we shall. Have a great day, folks.